He's really an extraordinary elder in our community and in the world, and I'm so glad that these master classes are happening. He's a research paleoanthropologist. I had to slow my words down. That's a big word. And he's a cutting-edge science that walks between worlds. He did his undergraduate work as well as master's degree in zoology at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then he got his doctorate in anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a native New Yorker and has spent much of his life living and working among traditional tribal peoples, primarily in Africa and Polynesia. He's also a shamanic practitioner, a teacher, and has authored to date 9 books. And these unusual books are focused upon a series of altered state experiences that began to spontaneously out of the bush in Africa, and they document his investigations into a hidden reality that most of us have never heard about, but few have experienced directly. And for everybody who's had a chance to attend Hank and Jill's workshop, Jill is his partner. He's transformed so many lives through this work. In the Spirit Walker trilogy, the first book is called Spirit Walker, the second book is Medicine Maker, and the third book is Vision Seeker, are really extraordinary. You should check them out. I'll mention 2 other books. His most recent book, one is Bowl of Light, which is his account of his time with a Hawaiian elder named Makua. And the other is The Reenchantment. And that's a phenomenal book. I'll mention one more book he wrote with Sandra Ingerman, Awakening to the Spirit World. So he really put out some incredible books and material and teaches around the world. So we're going to get going here soon. We're going to bring Hank on. Just one last quick note. You can type into the chat things. I'm going to be primarily looking there toward the end of the call, and we will field a few questions. Hank is mainly going to do a teaching this call, so you're welcome to type in questions, and we will probably get to a few at the end. And the second thing I want to mention, and then we're going to go live, and I'm going to give Hank the floor, is they are going to be, Hank is going to be releasing something called Shaman Visionary Circle, and it's through his company, Shared Wisdom. And for the first time, they're going to be doing basically a membership program, and they have a year curriculum planned out. It's going to be 47 different shamanic journeys. You could consider it a shamanic field guide for the other worlds. It's really going to be an extraordinary experience. That's going to be starting in June, and we're going to drop the link in later for that, so you can check that out and join us. And we'll send some email reminders out if you're watching a replay of this. Okay, without further ado, let me turn it over to Hank here, and we're going to just get going and have a great time on this webinar today. Hi, Hank.
Hey, Richard, thanks. You know, we've known each other for a long time, so this is a really nice reunion. Must be at least 15 years.
Just about 15 years, yeah.
About 15 years. Yeah, and Richard was also the producer of the Spirit Walker teachings, the 6 CD set, which is mentioned on the website. In fact, you became a producer, Richard.
Yeah, that was one of my first projects, and since then I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of people in the field. You know, Eckhart Tolle, Sounds True, and it's really amazing to be able to support the evolution of consciousness and to help people do their own inner work. But you guys were the start, and you know, we did that program, and I think it's helped a lot of people. So, and I think this upcoming membership is gonna as well.
Well, this is really very important work because what you guys do is you provide a trail crossing for members of the transformational community. The transformational community are progressives. And if the progressives, the only political thing I'll say, if they manage to sort of turn this ship around, we could have a very nice world indeed, in my opinion. And your contributions to that happening are great. You know, As an anthropologist, I was trained to be a hardcore mentalist, scientist. And when I was a little boy, I was quite different. I had this active imagination, which reminds me, if you hear something strange, there's a parrot right next to me, and she chips in from time to time. So, hear that? She just saw one of the cats. It's puss puss. Anyway, you know, this community is actually huge, and it's where I really find a lot of hope for the future. In my own case, you know, when I was a little boy, I had a very active imagination. I mean, when I went to the zoo in Central Park in New York, the animals talked to me. Now, that's not easy to explain to an adult because they're saying, oh, what an active imagination you have. But you know, I did. And I did that for years. And then one day I saw a creature in a cage which just captured my attention totally. It was a leopard. And I think it was one of the Amur leopards from China, which are among the most beautiful of creatures. And I was stunned. And I remember sitting there in my pram looking through the bars at this creature. And he was pacing, or she was pacing back and forth. And I had this deep insight that what I was seeing was a great will that was imprisoned. And when I had that thought, the leopard stopped and looked into my eyes, and something happened. And suddenly the leopard and I were in a blue place. Easiest way to describe it, no bars anymore. And then something happened. And you know, one of the hazards of growing old, I can't remember exactly what that was. You know, it just was what it was. But you know, all got shut down when I came out of my childhood. And then when I was in my 30s in the East African savanna bush around the northern end of Lake Turkana and the Omo River, I began to have visions. And I mean, I wondered sometimes if they were delusions, if they were daydreams, if they were fantasies. You know, I couldn't really answer that question at that point, but they were real and they got my attention. And I thought to myself, this is something worthy of investigation. And so when I came back to the States to finish my doctoral degree, you know, it was over. You know, I didn't have these strange delusional states anymore, these strange dreams. And then I met Sandra Ingerman, and we met at a workshop in Berkeley, first workshop I'd ever been to. And we ended up being paired next to each other as partners to do what is called power animal retrieval. And, you know, this was my very first exposure, and Michael Harner was the anthropologist blamming away on the drum. And you know, I'm lying there on the floor in this high school gymnasium with this really pretty woman lying next to me. And I'm thinking, what if she doesn't find anything? You know, it was an uncertain moment. And then when she came out of trance and sat up and sat me up and told me where she'd been and what she'd see, it was my old friend, the leopard. Now, there was just no way she could have known about my friend, the leopard man, because it was kind of like Calvin and Hobbes. Remember those guys? The cartoons? Yeah, Hobbes is really a stuffed animal. But for Calvin, he's alive and he's real. And in fact, he was. And that's one of the interesting things that shows up in the shaman's world. So what really drew me in this direction are these non-ordinary experiences. And then it got really weird. It's kind of like the ones I think of as the guys upstairs, the higher organizing intelligences, that they got tired of waiting for me to wake up and discover what I was really supposed to be doing in this life. Now, this was in my early 40s, and I was precipitated, as you know, into a visionary experience in which I had a face-to-face encounter with a very formidable being. This thing was at least 50 feet tall, like a huge black silhouette. And I think if I'd gone into fear, the doorway would have remained closed. because it took me for years to really figure out who this being was and what its function was. And I think it comes as a kind of threshold guardian. It exposes you to something that could be either terrifying or wonderful. And according to how you pass the test, you're then granted access to the zone of magnified power. But if you react with fear, doors will remain closed. You're not ready yet. So I think this spirit came to me in that genre, in that vein, and the rest of my life changed very dramatically. Very dramatically. My inner anthropologist, of course, always clicks on and starts taking notes and trying to figure things out. Like personally, as an anthropologist, I find Facebook kind of fascinating because I'm getting a look into a cross-section of the culture. And it may not be the culture that I'm part of, but it gives me a good sense of what people are paying attention to. Anyway, what this did is it drew me into the field of the shaman. And unlike people who come from indigenous traditions, I had no gifted elder teacher, aside perhaps from Michael Horner, who sort of set me back on the path again and just turned me loose. And then I experienced all sorts of stuff on my own. And of course, there were people I met along the way, like the Kahuna Halemakua, who contributed greatly to Jill's and my understanding of just about everything. And anyway, I began to go more deeply into this, excuse me, and it led me in the direction of something which I think of as spiritual unfolding. Now, that's a very good image, I think, of, for example, a lotus opening or a lily opening, because this is very much the way consciousness expands and grows. And so what I did is I started to do a little research and talk to people in my workshops. And as you know, because you went to virtually all of them, they were really designed to bring mystics together, modern mystics in our society. There are gazillions of us out there, and bring us together in a community where we could journey together, do field work together, because that's what anthropologists like to do. They like to do field work. And I began to discover something which I knew nothing about. This was back in the 90s. It was not my discovery. A lot of people knew about this, that there was a spiritual reawakening which was going on in the Western world. And that reawakening was characterized by a preference for non-Western belief systems. Zen, Taoism, we can start going down the list. Jain, Sufi, all the mystic traditions, Kabbalah. Eventually I think we come to a point in our life and our soul's unfolding when we become separate, accepting of sacred knowledge. And once you become accepting, it just kind of happens. So gatherings like the one we were just putting together now for an online circle, this is a very important thing that we're doing. In spiritual unfolding, if I've got this right, and I believe I do, and you've heard me say that before, there are basically 4 stages. And one of them is, well, they're really all initiatory statements, but we're going to talk a little bit more about initiation in the webinar on Saturday. But in this case, the very first stage of spiritual unfolding, and there seems to be a built-in mechanism of some sort for people to believe in something greater than themselves. Everybody finds this very reassuring somehow. The very first stage is belief. And there can be different kinds of beliefs. There can be magical beliefs, there can be mythic beliefs, there can be rational beliefs, there can be scientific beliefs. And beliefs are as good as far as they go. But you know, a person can hold on to a belief in an off-planet deity who works in mysterious ways for 20 or 30 years, and not much changes in their life. In other words, there's no growth. There's no growth. And so, although belief systems, some people stay with them their entire lives, you know, they'll not bring you into connection with what you're seeking. And this is usually when the next stage steps in. The next stage could be called faith. I remember when I was a little boy in boarding school, we had a headmaster as principal, and he used to, give us these, well, his class was the religious knowledge class. And so he used to make these absolutely outrageous proclamations, which I picked up as a fledgling scientist. And so we'd get into these really strong debates, and he would look at me and say, "Henry, just have faith, Henry." I can still hear him. He's probably been gone for 50 years. And faith didn't satisfy me. It didn't satisfy me. Now, faith can take you in two directions. It can either spiral you back down the hill into belief. And that's what fundamentalism is. The whole born-again phenomenon is in that camp. But when faith is doing its job, it takes you in the other direction. It takes you up the hill to the third stage of spiritual unfolding, which is direct experience. And this is the shaman's realm. This is what Western people tend to be interested in accessing and experiencing themselves. Direct experience. Because when you're drawn into a direct experience with spirit, it brings you immediately to the fourth and final stage, which is personal transformation. Because when you encounter these transpersonal forces, transpersonal implying that these are not projections of our own imaginations, that they are entities which have their own existence, agendas, and being separate from ourselves. When you encounter one of these guys, or maybe more than one, it changes you. It's no way it's not going to. And life then really becomes a kind of incredible adventure, as it becomes a way of life. I was drawn in direction of the shaman's path, and I remember being at the Asilomar Institute for Jill's 50th birthday back in 2002. And there were a lot of people there for a conference, including myself, including Ram Dass, and there was an anthropologist there named Paul Ray. And Paul Ray had created a book through the Institute of Noetic Sciences called The Cultural Creatives, How 50 Million People Are Changing the World. Now, he was a demographer, and on the basis of 14 years of surveys, as I recall, of the lower 48 states, he discovered there are about 50 million people, or even more at this time, who are interested in what we're talking about together today, who are involved in holding a system of beliefs, values, and trends that differ considerably from those of the general public. These are really mystics. They're really mystics. And being mystics, often like me, they stumble onto the shaman's path, and suddenly you've got a roadmap. Now, in doing visionary experience, there are a lot of people who have spontaneous experiences, a lot, which has given rise to the wonderment that there may actually be some kind of built-in genetic program on our inner hard drive, on our DNA. And when that program is double-clicked with the right mouse, like we're going to use the drum, we're going to use rhythmic percussion driving in order to achieve altered states. Everything changes for them. Everything changes for them. And the shamans of antiquity really became the first brave pioneers to investigate the mystery of human consciousness. When you think about it, You know, there are people who say that, you know, you got to be a psychologist to be a shaman. I don't believe that for a minute. You know, as an anthropologist, I've had this incredible life, which is recorded in my unusual books. I don't know what that is. Something just passed through. Did you see it? I didn't see it. I heard it though. Anyway, you know, these modern mystic beliefs are very easy to absorb, and I've written quite a lot about them. You know, it's first of all that people have a very clear understanding that there is more than one reality. There's the reality of everyday world and the reality of things hidden. Secondly, they hold the belief that individuals like you and I can be trained to enter these other realities at will. And they want that. And one of the things that they're looking for, if I could observe this without hubris, they're looking for authenticity. You can't bullshit the transformationals. You know, they know immediately if they're not in the presence of the real thing. But once you make contact with these inner worlds, worlds of things hidden, they're aware of the fact that these worlds of things hidden are inhabited. They're inhabited by those transpersonal forces that tribal people call spirits. And they want to have that experience. You know, for the last 50 years, through the work primarily of anthropologists and psychologists, the interest in shamanism has lifted considerably. You know, when I started to investigate this back in the 60s, you know, the good books on shamanism had been written on the fingers of two hands. You know, today there are stacks of books on shamanism, and people are recording their own visionary adventures and creating personal narratives which they hope will be financial successes. I'll just put out there because there are a lot right now. And Paul Ray actually felt that there were at least another 80 to 100 million of us in Europe. And this is very interesting information. He did this, of course, with surveys about what people liked and what they wanted. And one of the things that he discovered was that they all knew about the hero's journey. Now, when I say the hero's journey, this often brings up Joseph Campbell, who was a great mythologist who really publicized this strange cultural phenomenon through his books on mythology. But in the hero's journey, we learn that everyone is essentially living our own version of it. Everyone is the hero of our own journey. And he called that the monomyth. The monomyth, the one myth, the one singular story, which is found in all of the world's stories, all the sitcoms on TV, all the dramas, all the violence, everything is being dreamed into existence by the population at large. So the hero's journey, the hero is somebody like you, somebody like me, somebody like the guy who pumps gas at the gas station. I had an incredible adventure with a guy who was shipping all my paintings out to Hawaii when he told me that he was deaf until he was 4 years old. And then one day he heard somebody say, "You're going to hear." And he looks down and there's a ladybug. And this guy has been in relationship with the ladybug ever since. And with a little encouraging gestures from me, I got this incredible story out of him. Here was this freezing morning in November in Northern California, and we're building crates and putting paintings in crates. And he's telling me about his relationship with a ladybug. Now, there are a lot of people out there in society who've had experiences like this. I think of them as experiencers. And in pulling people into my workshops and comparing notes, you know, I discovered, like we will accomplish on our series, which is coming up, we'll give people a set of coordinates educate them in the method of induction, and then send people off to do field work and then compare notes. And what would be really fabulous if people journaled. Journaling is very important because they're often a way of sharpening what your subconscious remembers about the journey. And your subconscious may give you more information than you would have had otherwise. Journaling. In this way, with some very interesting information in this series in between, we're going to approach a topic called the mythic self, in which it's about channeling the new cultural mythos, the new story. Because our old myths, a lot of them are 4,000 years old, and they really don't have much meaning in our cyberspace world. And so a lot of the old myths, they're not crashing, they're being transformed. And that's one of the responsibilities that I feel very strongly. And many people in the shamanist community also feel this very strongly. So the effect that we have on the world in a spiritual, energetic sense, which includes emotional and mental, could have a very profound effect if it reaches a critical mass, I think. There's going to be a time when people are just not going to put up with the malarkey of our politicians. We're going to elect some good people, that's a very strongly held hope for me. But, the hero's journey, all right, the hero, somebody like you, somebody like me, we're living our lives, you're being a producer, I'm teaching college, and then one night, something happens. This is what happened to me, how I got into it. Something happened. And it completely changed my perspective of lots of things very, very quickly. It was the awesome jolt, the real thing. Now, this experience is what Campbell called the call, the summons. The summons to engage in an adventurous quest into the unknown, where you know absolutely nothing about what's going to happen next. But the compulsion to do so is strong. Well, most people won't go there. Most people want to live in their condo or their 4-bedroom house with a white picket fence and vote in the elections and pay their taxes and do their jobs, and they're kind of in the survival mode for, most of their lives. And they don't have time to think about these things, or if they do, they miss them. But the open invitation to engage in an adventure into the unknown, the hero is the man or the woman or the boy or the girl who decides to go for it. And it's kind of like that classic poem of Robert Frost, where we have two paths in the wood that diverge, and one path goes, the well-trodden, safe path, and the other one's all jungly and gnarly and overgrown. And who knows, there might be lions and tigers and bears out there. The hero is the one who takes the other path. And because of this, their life becomes this incredible adventure. There are various stages that the hero experiences in the quest to become involved with the experience of illumination. Illumination. We're going to explore that in this series. So this series is in many ways above and beyond my workshops that I teach at places like Brighton Bush and Mosswood and Omega. And it's also, to me, a very important sense of responsibility, because I've always been aware that because of geographic distance or financial concerns, there's so many people, so many sort of mystics out there who will never make it to a workshop because they can't afford it. They can't do it. They're trapped in a job and so forth and so on. So what you're creating, and we're going to create together, and Jill may chip in from time to time, what we're creating is a trail crossing, as I said earlier, for members of the transformational community to come together. The Hawaiian elder Hale Makua, about whom a book eventually was written, he used to say that the last cycle of ages was about separation. The last cycle of ages went on for about 2,000 years. And the new cycle, which we have, I think the responsibility to step up and into, is about connection. And this is a wonderful way to do it, because you hook up with people all over the world. Capito?
I love that, Hank. I love that the fact that we're entering this age of connection. And, I think that the current pandemic, seen in the right light, could be seen as a blessing for all of us to look at how we're connecting inwardly to our higher forces and spirit, and also externally to the rest of humanity and the planet. And it should, my sense is it will definitely shift or create a little bit more of the spiritual unfolding for many people on the planet.
I hope so too. I'm also aware, and we'll bring this up again in the module on spirit medicine, which I'd like to share some of with the group. We're not going to teach spirit medicine because that's beyond the scope of an online workshop, because there's so much hands-on work that happens. But, people are very interested in it. They're very interested in it. And spirit medicine is not particularly good for epidemic pandemics. I'll just come right out and say that. This is something I've heard from medicine men, medicine women, from shamans. They just say, well, pandemics or, epidemic diseases like measles and so forth and so on. These do not respond well, because shamanism is about nurturing and preserving the soul. When your soul is in good shape, you're in good shape. And if your soul is disempowered, or you're defeated by life, or your soul has been damaged because of life experiences, you become vulnerable. You become vulnerable. So when you're looking at the pandemic through the shamanist perspective, I pray that what it really is going to contribute is to touch our immune systems. Because ultimately, because we don't have a vaccine or medicine to treat it, it's going to be up to each individual's immune system to protect them. And it's in this kind of tune-up job that we evolve. And although there are people who don't like the word evolution, that's what's in the process of happening. And of course, there's always the chance that the coronavirus will evolve and mutate into a neutral form. That would also be a highly desirable outcome. But whether or not you could make that happen depends on whether you have magic beliefs. There's a lot of magic thinking going on right now in our leadership. And magic is really about the belief that through your ego and your intentionality, you can affect the world as well as the people in it. And that you can heal people through the power of your intention and so forth and so on. That's a belief system. A mythic belief system occurs when we realize that we're not all powerful, and we begin to direct responsibility for gods and goddesses and deities and angels and Jesus and so forth and so on. In other words, we delegate authority. And of course, none of this works. In the end, it's, what can you say? People hope for the best, but whatever happens, happens. But in terms of the COVID virus, this is Nasruan. And as an anthropologist, I was involved with the fossil man field for most of my career. And one of the things we know is that there have been population crashes in the past. Like there was a big one 60,000 years ago. And we know this from microbiology, from cell biology, when we examine the genetics of all human beings on the planet. And the fact is that we're all very much like each other. You know, if all the different racial stocks in the world were separated by millions of years, the way some people thought about it 150 years ago, there'd be considerable diversity, but there's not. So that means that about 60,000 years ago, something culled the population. Now, this is just straight zoology. On the one hand, we know from our studies of contemporary ecosystems that species that over-reproduce inevitably crash. They involve in catastrophic over-reproduction, and bam, they're gone. And then the next stage sort of emerges. This is easy to study in animals, not so much in humans, because we have very long periods of gestation and life and so forth and so on. But you know, the shaman is the individual who holds the equilibrium of their community in their capable hands, because the shaman is a kind of like an antecessor or a link between the human community and the natural world. And until the development of agriculture, or perhaps afterwards, human beings have always known that if they took care of the environment would take care of them. And they were all very good stewards. We've been very bad stewards, Richard. This is one of the beliefs of the transformational community, by the way, that, you know, we need to do something and very quickly, you know, because we're heading towards a blank wall, and that's not going to be a good experience for anybody. We've talked about that before. But, you know, there's something else that's interesting here. When I went to Africa in the Peace Corps, I didn't know anything about shamans or medicine men or medicine people. But what I was aware of as an anthropologist was a phenomenon called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the ability to view the beliefs and customs of others within the context of their culture rather than from one's own, judging it from one's own. And this does not come naturally to humans. All humans tend to think of their own culture as the culture, you know, and sometimes as superior. Many consider other cultures as somehow being less than human. But the interesting thing is that people who feel this way, this is what's called ethnocentrism. And it was something that all of us who went into the Peace Corps or who've lived in the tribal world have to overcome. And it's not easy to put yourself in the skin of a tribal woman or a tribal man and understand their word from their perspective. But you know what? It's one of the things that makes anthropology absolutely fascinating. And so, you know, I hope to be able to draw on my Africa experiences and provide our seminarians, because that's what they are, seminarians with interesting stories. I discovered when I used to teach in university and college that if you gave people sort of a straight, dry-up lecture, kind of like I've been doing today, you know, they have maybe 10, 15% chance of remembering. But if you tell them a story, they never forget your stories.
Right. You know, just kind of moving into that, I think a lot of people on this call, there's over 500 people on the call right now, which is incredible.
Really?
Yeah, I think, and you know, you've been teaching, you have such a loyal community. Anybody who, like I said earlier, attends one of your workshops really has some kind of transformation. It's a really loyal following. But for maybe somebody who's new, would you maybe share a little bit about what happened when you started to shoot into the future, into, because I think that kind of lays some foundation about how your journey, your own hero's journey went, and then you had some choices.
Well,
Now that's a pretty long story, so you might have to shorten it here because we don't have that much time.
well, this brings up the Spirit Walker story. And the Spirit Walker story, I've never read anything like it. because it's essentially about Indiana Jones goes time traveling. Indiana Jones, that's me. That's what I do as an anthropologist, you know. But the time traveling thing really threw me into a quandary because I found myself connecting through the dream time with a man who lives in the future. And to cut to the chase, the time came when this man discovered that I was merging with him and I was seeing his world through his eyes, you know, hearing his thoughts through his mind, tasting his food through his tongue. It was a very strange experience. It was like spirit possession, but I was the one who was doing the possessing, and he was the receiver. Then when it started to happen in reverse, and he eventually found me here in Kona and merged with me, having a look at my wife, my children, my house, my environment, looking at the inside of my mind, my books. You know, the books blew him away because he's a scholar like me, and he saw me as this incredible source of lost knowledge, which he's still accessing today, I might add, from time to time. Now, writing about something like this is pretty risky. As a scientist, I work at the top of my field. You know, I've worked with the greats, the superstars. And as a result of that connection with the Dark Guardian, I realized that although I was at the top of my ladder, that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. And it was time for me to work up the ladder on the other wall. And I'm still doing it. You know, I consider myself an apprentice. Although we talk about master this and master classes, you know, I don't really know if there are any masters. I think we're all students. At least that's how I feel most of the time. So I try to pay attention. But these experiences, they led me into a completely new direction in my life. And when I wrote Spirit Walker, I wrote it as fiction for the first time because I thought it was just too weird. I didn't think anybody would believe it. And then, fortunately, I encountered a Hawaiian elder in Fremont, in California, of all places, who had a biker for a husband. And she was a fully initiated Hawaiian kahuna elder. And Jill was in relationship with her. They were doing healing work together. And there was a time when we went to her house and Jill disappeared for 2 hours. And then when Nalita came out, she looked me over and Jill said, "Are you going to work on him now?" And this kahuna looked at me and said, "I don't need to work on him. He needs to talk." And so, you know, this is the storytelling. This is the great gift. We're story people. And so I told her some of the story of Spirit Walker. And she looked at me and said, "Listen, you can't publish this as fiction. You must own it. You're not a new age woo-woo. You know, you're a professor with a PhD and you teach university classes." She said, "You've got a lot of mana." She said, "You've got to own this one." And so when that book was published, you know, everything began to happen. And I began to get invited to institutes and research centers and so forth and so on to give talks and conferences. It's been really fun.
You also were blackballed by your academic community too, weren't you? Or that was part of the...
They're not happy with me. You know, excuse me, somebody in my field would regard publishing a book like Spirit Walker as career-aside. That would be the end of the career. And in a sense, it contributed to the end of mine, although mine never really stops because I'm sitting on this mountain of data. And my former colleagues who have mixed feelings about me, you know, they realize that if they go after me and attack me, I won't give them my data. And they want my data. So it's kind of like I'm holding a hostage, which I do have to finish off before I check out. It's a big monograph about an assemblage of fossils in Ethiopia in the Middle Pliocene. And it's interesting because the fossils of humans that were recovered from those same levels could very well be the missing link. I mean, this thing is literally half ape, half human. You know, it can do this with its big toe, but it can walk bipedally on the ground as well. This is unusual. It's kind of like the holy grail of anthropology.
Right.
So I was the one who got away.
Well, I think a lot of people, especially, you know, shamanism has kind of come in and out, but I think a lot of it is about, I think you said it earlier, owning your own power. And I think there's probably a lot of closet shaman in the world, you know, that probably hide that part of themselves. You can't go walk into your cubicle and kind of tell people some of these things. You have to kind of keep it silent for those that aren't in the inner circle. So, I mean, in some ways, that's the great thing about the online community we're forming, that it's a community of people who want to do the work and, you know, come online every week to do this journey. So can you talk a little bit about, I know, you know, in your continuum and in some of your courses, maybe just talk briefly about the role of the foundation, because I think a lot of people are resetting their foundation now with what's happening in the world. And then I'll open it up to a few questions and we can answer a few questions from people as well, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Well, when Joe and I were in relationship with the Hawaiian elder, he was sketching on a tablecloth one day. We were in some place like the Hard Rock Cafe. And Joe says, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm sort of designing a new foundation for my Spiritual Warrior Society." And this led to a discussion about the fact that each one of us has a foundation to our life and to our time in which we live. And if you've got a foundation that's got blocks missing from it, stones missing from it, it's a very good thing to find out what those stones are and see if you could repair your foundation. Because very often repressed aspects of the self or damaged aspects of the self may spontaneously return. This is medicine. This is spirit medicine. But he also said that when your life is going to restructure itself, and I might add, as many of you know, that the shamanist tradition, it can be life-changing. Can be life-changing. That means for all your future lives as well. So you're in for a great run. You know, this is really part of what it's all about. Well, part of what it's all about, really, to discover who you are, what you're here to do, where you can invest your mana, your energy. And, you know, the shamanist tradition is a very interesting way to approach that, because you look at the inner worlds. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful. It's always like that, the expert mind's curse, but I think it would be really useful just to review the basic premise of the type of shamanism you do, and maybe talk a little bit about the sacred garden and how you use that as kind of a jumping point.
We can do that.
And just because I think we'll have some people on here that maybe want to know what your version of it is, and then how that's linked to the foundation. I think that would be interesting.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with a Peruvian shaman just a week ago named Don Oscar Miro Casada. And one of the things he brought up is that there are really two kinds of shamanism. There's traditional shamanism. And traditional shamanism is usually hooked into an ancestral tradition that has come down across time within community lineages. And then there is Western shamanism. And Western shamanism means that, you know, those of us who have the visionary ability very rarely have any kind of tradition to draw upon or to go for, although many people do. You know, you've got a lot of people, for example, who are drawn towards South America and Peru and Ecuador and so forth and so on. You got a lot of people drawn towards Celtic shamanism, despite the fact that Celts may or may not have had shamans. You know, we can talk about that, but not today. Anyway, you know, in Western shamanism, there's been a lot of contribution from a lot of teachers to creating a kind of core. In other words, when you strip off all the cultural items, the rituals, the ceremonies, the words, the chants, the objects, when you take all that away, you're left with a core tradition, which is common to all of them. And it's extraordinarily simple. You know, I said to an anthropologist friend once, how do you tell when somebody's an authentic shaman? And he looked at me and he said, 3 things. First of all, do they journey to other worlds? Second of all, do they have relationships with spirits? And thirdly, do they perform miracles or facilitate miracles? And as you know from having worked with Jill and I, you know, the miracles happen all the time. In a sense, we've lived the last 25, 30 years of our lives in the field of the miraculous. And that's what being a visionary is all about. And it's all the time. But coming into a series of sessions like we're going to do, it helps people, first of all, to give them a roadmap. And then secondly, to help them sharpen the sword of wisdom and experience so that they can be of service. Because as McCoy used to say, we've all come to be of service. So paying attention to your foundation is very important because you're going to build on that foundation. You're going to stand on that foundation. And that foundation is going to support you in becoming who and what you're destined to become. It's about your destiny. But you got to have a foundation. And a lot of people have very crappy foundations, to be honest. They do. Does that give you some ideas?
Yeah, that definitely does. And your core practice is through the journey is basically rhythmic percussion, and then you're given guidance to go and travel to these other worlds in kind of an altered state. Is that correct?
That is correcto. The fact is that, you know, in the workshops that Jill and I designed to connect with these modern mystics out there on the road, we would give people sort of coordinates without telling them what to see. And they would go off on these visionary journeys in response to the drum. And they would come back with accounts that would pass muster at any Aboriginal campfire. You know, this was mind-blowing because there were so many commonalities between them. There were so many convergences. They were seeing the same thing that the Aboriginal Australians were seeing, or the Yoruba, or the Peruvians. You know, I mean, you could go in any direction you want to, because the spirit world is kind of like a fabric, which is woven on an immense loom across space-time. And we're going to talk about that, but not today. I used to say that to my students and it drove them crazy. Yeah.
Well, I know I've spent many weeks with you, and there's some of the best teachings are around the dinner table or the walks through the dinner table. And we could go on for hours and hours, but we're almost at the hour here. So we are pretty much still at around 515 people are still watching. If you have a question specifically for Hank about, mainly about the evolution of Western shamanism and spiritual unfolding that's happening in the West right now and where we're at, please go ahead and ask your questions in there. And while I'm waiting for these questions to come in, I'm just going to share a little bit about what Hank and Jill, who's in the background with her laugh and the parrot, have been creating. What we're going to be doing starting in June is Hank is going to be leading a group through a 1-year online visionary program, and it'll include weekly journeys. I think they have 47 separate journeys mapped out, and these will be live journeys, and you'll be able to get the recordings or attend live. And I don't know of anything that's really been put out of this depth and quality before. And I think one of the questions I saw earlier was, how is this going to be a little bit different from what you've done in the past, Hank? Are you going to be adding in some new stuff? And how might this vary from what, because I'm sure a lot of the people on this call have already worked with you. How is it going to be a little bit different or the same?
Well, The one big commonality is going to be the foundation, because we have to bring people in who are not so familiar with the shamanist tradition and create the foundation. And then that we can build on. And I'm going to draw from my knowledge as an anthropologist, as well as from my university teachings, to bring certain things forward, which we've never talked about in workshops.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we've never talked about sorcery and negative witchcraft
Mm-hmm.
and its role in shamanic illness or shamanic healing. Mm-hmm. Because, that involves some dark stuff. We're going to talk about spontaneous journeys, out-of-the-body experiences, lucid dreams, and, meditations. Very often people journey in meditation. With your permission.
Yeah.
Start with the grounding and building of your shamanic foundation. And that's important for everybody, because if somebody hasn't been journeying for a long time, this is about building your power back up. Yeah. Then we're going to talk about the spirits. Did you hear that? That was the parrot. Said, yeah. We're going to talk about the types of spirits, the spirit teacher, the spirit guides. They're different. The three souls, ancestral spirits. That'll be a little familiar for some people. That's the second part teachings. Then I'm going to talk about the evolution of religion. And we're going to start with animism and nature mysticism and animatism. Then we'll talk about polytheism and monotheism. And we'll talk about how, religion seems to be related to the way in which societies are organized. And this is, I think, something that's very interesting to know, and these different spiritual traditions. We're going to talk about spiritual organization. We'll talk about ritual and ceremony and magic, sorcery and negative witchcraft, the classic causes of illness, protection, the classic levels of shamanic healing, personal healing ritual. Then I've got a block of information on Native American mysticism. We're going to talk first about the general mystical principles, not religion, but mysticism. It's the core again.
And I think I want to jump in here and just say we're going to list all of this on the page for the thing.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll go ahead and drop the link so people can start to check that out. And what I'd like to do is just get a couple questions out, because we told people they could ask questions. So let me give a few here that I think are pretty interesting. One question is, the transition from the old myths to the new myths. What is the new myth that's being created now, and what are the new archetypes that are unfolding in the collective consciousness right there? I think that's really fascinating, that question.
Okay, this is a deep question, because did you hear the parrot? It says okay. Okay, this is a very deep question, because in a sense, we created the archetypes. They didn't create us. We created them. And the archetypes are energetic thought forms that feed on the belief systems of their supporters. In other words, nobody really believes in Zeus anymore, but Zeus was one of the big guys for about 1,000 years. And he's modeled after Yahweh among the Canaanites. Yahweh was originally a Canaanite thunder god. And these archetypes, once they take on density from people's paying attention to them, it's chancy dealing with them. It's chancy dealing with them, because they tend to manifest aspects of the human psyche, both the dark side and the light side. So we were going to do something with dark mysticism and light mysticism towards the end of the series. But, what are we going toward? That's a very good question, because, part of our job, I think, as modern mystics, is to channel the new cultural mythos, to channel the new story. Because the old story, it isn't that these old stories aren't good anymore or they're bad. It's just that they're not meant to be taken literally. A mythos is not meant to be taken literally. And they must be nature focused, I think, because that's where the power is. New myths are being created by us, and we're doing it consciously. Jill just wrote me a note. I think this is important, and it's a very good place to achieve closure to our series in May of next year, April, May of next year. I mean, it's incredible to think it's that far in advance already.
Yeah.
But if we meet on a weekly basis, this allows me to tell people stories. Haha.
Right.
Makua. Did you ever meet Makua?
I didn't know. He passed
Yeah,
before I
he did.
had a chance.
Yeah, he passed about 15, 16 years ago now. Makua used to say, when love moves out, fear moves in. And so what our job is to find out where we've sunk our anchor. Because if we've sunk our anchor in fear, that's what's running the show. But if we draw that anchor up consciously and with intention and deliberately, and we resync it in the positive polarity, and then maintain our discipline to keep it in the positive polarity, life can change very dramatically.
Yeah, I love how you talk about moving into the positive polarity just as a guidepost to where is your anchor.
Might have to say a little bit about the laws of polarity, but not today.
Yeah, not today. I mean, it's kind of hard because there's if you get Hank going, we're here for the rest of the night basically. Let me ask one final question that popped into the chat here, and people are just asking a bit about what's happened to Nainoa. So Hank, the main character that Hank would flip into, or a personage in the future, his name is Nainoa. He has a longer name that Hank can share here. But I think they're just asking, is there still connection? Is that connection ongoing, or where is it?
This is a good question, because when Vision Seeker, the third book in the trilogy, was published, within a year, that connection between the two of us closed, and it was over. And I didn't seem to be able to open it up. And he wasn't coming from his direction in my direction. And then, to make the long story short, I think it was in 2010 or 2011, Jill and I were in a hotel next to the freeway in Sacramento, and the connection was reestablished. And he came into my mind and into my soul, and into my body for that matter, for about, maybe 15 minutes. He needed information. So we were back in connection again, and he's involved in a fantastic project right now. In my connections with him, which are when I can take the time to actually turn in that direction now because I'm so busy, I decided to engage in an experiment, because that's what scientists do. So I asked Nainoa to write the fourth book, and he's in the process of writing his version of what's transpired in his life in the 10 years that we were not in connection. So I've got about, I would say, 190 typed pages already. And he's writing about, his great endeavors and his family life and his lovers and horses and the Enu people who he goes back to. It's going to be an interesting book. I've just got to take more time to finish it.
Well, we definitely have to move that forward and underway.
Okay.
Well, we're at about 70 minutes now, and I want to respect everybody's time. And it's challenging to do these things in an hour, but we have 2 more sessions, one on Saturday and one, I think, next Wednesday. So make sure you attend those. And I've dropped the link a few times in here for the new program. There's a lot of other great questions in here. I apologize that we couldn't get to every question. And thanks, everybody, for attending this short talk by Hank. Hank, do you have any closing words for the people who are here or the community?
See the light on top of my head? That's it. That's it. That's spirit right there. Anyway, Makua, there's a wonderful story that Makua has told, but, essentially he laid a number on us. He said, I wouldn't be talking to you guys if you guys weren't spiritual warriors. And I assume that that goes for everybody who's listening today as well, and those who may join us. He said the path of the spiritual warrior is very narrow, and it's constrained by 3 sacred directives. Number 1, you must love all that you see with humility. And when he said that, I thought to myself, wow, easy one first. And he laughed because he was psychic and he picked it up. He said, oh, I worked on that one for 7 years. Number 2, you must live all that you feel with reverence. And that reverence isn't just about propriety, it's about an active respect which is offered to everyone and everything that you encounter in life. And thirdly, we must know all that we possess with discipline, because when you walk the red road, when you walk the spiritual path, self-discipline is very important.